Random House Audio presents A Sound Among the Trees by Susan Meissner. Read for you by Susan Denaker. There's a sound among the forest trees. Away, boys. Away to the battlefield. Hurrah! Hear its thunders from the mountain. No delay, boys. We'll gird on the sword and shield. Shall we falter on the threshold of our fame, boys? Fanny Crosby, 1861. Part 1. The Garden. The bride stood in a circle of Virginia sunlight, her narrow heels clicking on Holly Oak's patio stones as she greeted strangers in the receiving line. Her wedding dress was a simple A-line, strapless, with a gauzy skirt of white that breezed about her ankles like lacy curtains at an open window. She had pulled her unveiled brunette curls into a loose arrangement dotted with tiny flowers that she'd kept alive on her flight from Phoenix. Her only jewelry was a white topaz pendant at her throat and the band of platinum on her left ring finger. Tall, slender, and tanned from the famed and relentless Arizona sun, hers was a girl-next-door look, pretty but not quite beautiful. Adelaide thought it odd that Marielle held no bouquet. From the parlor window, Adelaide watched as her grandson-in-law, resplendent in a black tuxedo next to his bride, bent toward the guests and greeted them by name, saying, "This is Marielle." An explanation seemed ready to spring from his lips each time he shook the hand of someone who had known Sarah, her deceased granddaughter, his first wife. Carson stood inches from Marielle, touching her elbow every so often, perhaps to assure himself that after 4 years a widower, he had indeed patently and finally moved on from grief. Smatterings of conversations wafted about on the May breeze and into the parlor as received guests strolled toward trays of sweet tea and champagne. Adelaide heard snippets from her place at the window. Hudson and Brett, her great-grandchildren, had moved away from the snaking line of gray suits and pastel dresses within minutes of the first guest's arrival, and were now studying the flower-festooned gift table under the window ledge, touching the bows, fingering the silvery white wrappings. Above the children, an old oak's youngest branches shimmied to the tunes a string quartet produced from the gazebo beyond the receiving line. Adelaide raised a teacup to her lips and sipped the last of its contents, allowing the lemony warmth to linger at the back of her throat. She had spent the better part of the morning readying the garden for Carson and Marielle's wedding reception, plucking spent geranium blossoms, ordering the catering staff about, and straightening the rented linen tablecloths. She needed to join the party now that it had begun. The blue-haired old ladies would be wondering where she was. Her friends had been the first to arrive, coming through the garden gate on the south side of the house at 5 minutes before the hour. She'd watched as Carson introduced them to Marielle, witnessed how they cocked their necks in blue-headed unison to sweetly scrutinize her grandson-in-law's new wife, and heard their welcoming remarks through the open window. Dolores gushed about how lovely Marielle's wedding dress was, and what, pray tell, was the name of that divine purple flower she had in her hair. Pearl invited Marielle to her bridge club next Tuesday afternoon and asked her if she believed in ghosts. Maxine asked her how Carson and she had met, though Adelaide had told her weeks ago that Carson met Marielle on the internet, and why on earth Arizona didn't like daylight saving time. Marielle had smiled, sweet and knowing, like the kindergarten teacher who finds the bluntness of 5-year-olds endearing, and answered the many questions. Mojave asters. She didn't know how to play bridge. She'd never encountered a ghost, so she couldn't really say, but most likely not. She and Carson met online. there's no need to save what one has an abundance of. Carson had cupped her elbow in his hand, and his thumb caressed the inside of her arm while she spoke. Adelaide swiftly set the cup down on the table by the window, whisking away the remembered tenderness of that same caress on Sarah's arm. Carson had every right to remarry. Sarah had been dead for 4 years. She turned from the bridal tableau outside and inhaled deeply the gardenia-scented air in the parlor. Unbidden thoughts of her granddaughter sitting with her in that very room gently nudged her. Sarah at 6, cutting out paper dolls, memorizing multiplication tables at age 8, sewing brass buttons onto gray wool coats at 11, Sarah reciting a poem for English Lit at 16, comparing college acceptance letters at 18, sharing a chance letter from her estranged mother at 19, showing Adelaide her engagement ring at 24. Coming back home to Hollyoake with Carson when Hudson was born, nursing Brett in that armchair by the fireplace, leaning against the doorframe and telling Adelaide that she was expecting her 3rd child. Right there Sarah had done those things while Adelaide sat at the long table in the center of the room, empty now, but usually awash in yards of stiff Confederate gray, glistening gold braid, and tiny piles of brass buttons, the shining elements of officer reenactment uniforms before they see war. Adelaide ran her fingers along the table's polished surface, the warm wood as old as the house itself. Carson had come to her just a few months ago while she sat at that table piecing together a sharpshooter's forest green jacket. He had taken a chair across from her as Adelaide pinned a collar, and he'd said he needed to tell her something. He'd met someone. When she'd said nothing, he added, "It's been 4 years, Adelaide." "I know how long it's been." The pins made a tiny plucking sound as their pointed ends pricked the fabric. "She lives in Phoenix." "You've never been to Phoenix." "Mimi." He said the name Sarah had given her gently, as a father might, a tender reprimand. He waited until she looked up at him. "I don't think Sarah would want me to live the rest of my life alone. I really don't. And I don't think she would want Hudson and Brett not to have a mother." "Those children have a mother." "You know what I mean. They need to be mothered. I'm gone all day at work. I only have the weekends with them. And you won't always be here. You're a wonderful great-grandmother, but they need someone to mother them, Mimi." She pulled the pincushion closer to her and swallowed. "I know they do." He leaned forward in his chair. "And I miss having someone to share my life with. I miss the companionship. I miss being in love. I miss having someone love me." Adelaide smoothed the pieces of the collar. "So, you are in love?" He had taken a moment to answer. "Yes, I think I am." Carson hadn't brought anyone home to the house, and he hadn't been on any dates. But he had lately spent many nights after the children were in bed in his study, the former library, with the door closed. When she'd pass by, Adelaide would hear the low bass notes of his voice as he spoke softly into his phone. She knew that gentle sound. She had heard it before, years ago, when Sarah and Carson would sit in the study and talk about their day, his voice deep and resonant, hers soft and melodic. "Are you going to marry her?" Carson had laughed. "Don't you even want to know her name?" She had not cared at that moment about a name. The specter of being alone in Hollyoake shoved itself forward in her mind. If he remarried, he'd likely move out and take the children with him. "Are you taking the children?" Are you leaving Hollyoak?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?